Hello and welcome to this thought leadership interview. Today we're looking at the Fit for 55 package and all the aims associated with the Repower EU proposals, an ambitious agenda put forward by the European Commission. Now, joining me to talk about that, I have from the European Parliament, Ciarán Cuffe, Rapporteur of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, obviously a key area that we need to look at in terms of addressing this Fit for 55 proposal, because buildings are in fact such a huge source of CO2 emissions that they are almost representing a low-hanging fruit. Also, Philippe Delorme, who is the CEO of Europe Operations at Schneider Electric. Philippe, I will start with you actually, Philippe. I mean, I mentioned the Buildings Directive. In a sense, the house is on fire, is it not?
Yes, it is. And actually, that story started when we talk about carbon, and that started like a couple of years ago. And I would say one of the unfortunate impact of the Ukrainian war is much more tension in the field of energy, and we understand the relationship with Russia. And we are moving from a carbon topic, which was already very serious, to now a topic of energy security. And I think for people who are listening to us, it might not be obvious, but no energy, no economy, no life, no nothing. And we are touching actually something that's even more critical and that reinforces the urgency to act decisively on the European energy policy. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble, and we could be in trouble actually starting next winter. So that's very serious stuff.
I mean, you say no life, no nothing. I mean, we haven't somehow grasped the essentials of why energy is so important. I know that you often take as an example the situation we saw in Texas, that, you know, this is about hospitals, this is about travel, this is about mobility, this is also about where we live in our homes.
Yep, and I think it was, I mean, close to us, last big shock was really Fukushima 10 years ago, which really called in Japan for a big step change in energy efficiency, in market flexibility. But I would say the North America and US has been more used to those crises. So last year, indeed, in Texas in February, the network shut down because there was too much demand versus supply, which, by the way, could happen next winter in Europe. And if this does happen, that means that indeed there are no hospital, your home is powerless for God knows how long time. Impact on life, because more elderly people would be actually very, very vulnerable, young kids and so on. So we've never been used in Europe, or not in the very distant past, to energy crisis, but these are not theoretical things. These are very practical risks. And this topic of energy security is, in my view, as critical as the COVID crisis that we've been through. Now, the problem we have is we are not reacting as fast as what we did on COVID for actually a very clear immediate danger that could impact us very, very quickly.
Ciarán, Philippe there mentioned relationships between things. It's very interconnected. Tell me about the links between buildings and this energy crisis that we might see ourselves in.
Well, we know that buildings use 40% of the energy within the European Union and are responsible for 36% of the greenhouse gas emissions. But as you rightly pointed out, they can be the low-hanging fruit. If we insulate our attic, if we replace our windows with double or treble glazing, we can reduce the amount of energy that we consume. Or if we do a deep renovation, moving away from the gas boiler towards heat pumps, we can really decarbonize our energy use. So we have the ability to dramatically reduce the energy use, and that can be a win-win. It can be better, it can mean lower bills for those who live in the building, it can mean lower greenhouse gas emissions, and it can also be good for the local economy, because the supply chains are often quite local. But I think what we've learned with Ukraine and with the kind of the global energy crisis at the moment is that many of these supply chains go all the way around the world. I know within my own country we have a coal-burning power station that used to get its coal from Russia, but it now gets it from Colombia in South America. And I think in the long term, we want to try and reduce these global supply chains to increase our energy security. So when the shocks come, whether that they are political, whether they are weather related, we're ready for them. And I think for most of us in Europe today, yes, we've seen some extreme weather events of high winds or floods, but people don't remember how bad things can be. And I'm old enough just to remember the oil crisis from 1980. I was a kid, but I do remember my parents queuing in their car for days outside a petrol station to get petrol. And there is a real risk that we might see these kind of challenges again this coming winter. So the more we can do in the short term to move to renewable energy, to insulate our homes, to turn down the thermostat where we can, all of this will help with the crisis.
Well, we're talking about there's so many overlapping crises at the moment. It's almost hard to keep on top of which one we're talking about. But you alluded to it, these global supply chains, and one of the key phrases now in 2022 is about sovereignty, about also resilience, and about looking at those dependencies that we see on Russia in particular. I mean, how big a role are geopolitics playing in our challenge in the challenges we already face in Europe?
I think they're at the heart of a huge amount of what we do. And it just doesn't run through the direct energy supplies. You can see one of the Fit for 55 files is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Essentially, other countries don't put a price on carbon the way the European Union is. So we need a new law that says, listen, folks, if you're bringing stuff into the EU, you have to pay a carbon price on it. So I think geopolitics does come into it. It comes into it immediately with our dependency on Russia. But when we look at something like solar panels, we used to build a lot of them within Europe, but China underbid us and they're coming in much more cheaply from China. So that leads to a greater dependency going halfway around the world. So I think looking ahead over the next few years, yes, we need to decarbonize, but I think we need to produce a lot of the products for decarbonization within the 27 member states that are part of the European Union. Because if we don't, we're at risk of further supply chain problems in the coming years.
Well, Philippe, you articulated quite well about the aspirations and why we need this change. What do you see as the current big challenges? Are there incumbents pushing back on it? Are there gaps in the thinking coming from EU level, or even if there's disparities in member state levels? Where do you identify those key lever points?
Let's talk at the good news, which is technologies are available. And actually, a lot of those technologies can be championed by European players and actually reinforce energy security. We just issued actually today a survey on building efficiency. And actually what we see is when you combine three sets of technologies, which is solar panels, where clearly solar panels and the solar conversion, some of it coming from China. So there is work to do here. Heat pump electrification of usage, including electric vehicle and stuff like this, which are very close to buildings. And third, digitization or energy efficiency measures, where there are a lot of European players. And I'm not mentioning all the workforce that would be jobs that needs to happen in Europe and that are actually big opportunities. When you combine those three technologies together, we've made surveys in residential, hotel, shopping malls, real estate, and so on. We see massive benefits. 80% carbon reduction by 2030. A reduction of OPEX, of operating costs when it comes to energy of -20 to -80%, for overall an extra cost of 5%. Now, so that's the very good news. Now, the topic we have is how do we accelerate by a factor of 10x the adoption of those technologies? Because today we are in wartime, viewed by me and viewed by us at Schneider as what the energy crisis is in front of us, and the speed at which we are taking all of this is not right.
How do you, when as Philippe says there's a lack of urgency at the moment, how do we incentivize end users towards decarbonisation, towards more energy efficiency? And is there a difference between end users in terms of, say, building residents, or, if you like, business users? And are the incentives and the levers different?
Yeah, there's different incentives and different levers. It's interesting because that brings us into a question of what does government do? What does the European Union do? And yes, we need to incentivize, we need to regulate, but we also need to empower. We need to empower the consumer, the resident, the driver, to make that change, to move to electrification of the way that they get around, to move towards reducing the amount of energy that they use in a building. And if we do, as you said yourself, if we link all of these things together, the rooftop solar, the heat pumps, the controls on these systems, the electrification of mobility, there can be a win-win for everyone.
Well, Philippe mentioned the potential of technologies, which we can see there. I'll come back to you in a moment on what those are. But are there the skills? Are there the workforce there to do it? We see in some countries that there is a skills shortage. We hear, for example, in the area of digitalization, there's a skills shortage. What do we see in this sector in terms of a skilled workforce to deliver on these possibilities?
There is a problem because I think in some areas that where the economy is doing well, the construction sector has been acting at full pace over the last few years. I know within my own country that is the challenge. So I think we need to bring more people into these sectors. I think we need to have a clear message that these are good jobs. They are long-term jobs. You can work for a lifetime in energy efficiency or in reducing the energy needs of a building, and there will be a job there for you. But we do need to reskill, and I think governments have to incentivize third-level institutes to provide the apprenticeships, to provide the degrees, to provide the short-term continued professional development, to bring the architects, the engineers, the heating and ventilation engineers, to make sure that they know how to help their clients save money on the installation and the management of the systems within a building.
Well, Philippe, staying with this question of the different technologies and even thinking about end-use electrification, I mean, could there be a successful transition without storage, for example? Or what about others? What about hydrogen? What about CSS? You know, there's CCS. There's other methods. I mean, what is the secret formula?
Actually, the best watt is a megawatt. And okay, hydrogen maybe is going to be green hydrogen, because grey hydrogen is not green. But green hydrogen will probably take 10 years to materialize. We don't have 10 years. So we need to find something else. When looking at those opportunities and actually getting inspired by what happened in Fukushima 10 years ago, Japan put in place very strict measures on energy efficiency, very well done, but they also put in place some flexibility markets so that actually consumers and large consumers that would be interested to shed their loads before the peak does happen get money in exchange of that. That's what we call demand response or curtailment. That's the most practical and immediate way to put in place, say, energy storage, because instead of having to store energy, you actually shed some loads which produce the same thing, which is when you need energy, either you produce more or actually you avoid to produce because some of the large users or a lot of smaller users would be federated into I opt in and I'm ready in exchange of some money to shed my loads. That's happening in North America, that's happening in Japan, that's happening in Australia. It's not happening at scale in Europe at a time where I'm afraid anyway, in a couple member states, we will have to enforce system like this. So we have a few weeks or a few months to choose whether we'd like to do that. And my wish, and we are actually advocating this in most of the member states, is to put that in place sooner than later as actually the emergency measures to mitigate the shortage that we will have in next winter, which is indeed very serious.
Ciarán, you're involved as the rapporteur in drawing up the legislation around this. How important is flexibility between member states? It's a perennial question at EU level. How do you deal with the disparities?
Look, we have to be careful not to say that one size fits all. We have to recognize the geographical and political imbalances that we face, and also different climates. The Nordic countries tend to have quite efficient buildings because they have long, harsh winters. But you can also, we have buildings around the Mediterranean that can be freezing cold in winter and that can be overheated, that can be far too hot in the summer. So if we upgrade these buildings, we can produce the right result. But clearly we need to incentivize the right technologies in different climates. And it can be solar, more solar in Southern Europe. It can be wind in Western Europe. It can be hydropower in the north. So we do need to have that flexibility within what we do. But ultimately, reducing the amount of energy that a building needs.
Well, you alluded to it in your first answer, but let me ask you then about how you think the proposals like Fit for 55 and Repower EU actually protect European consumers from price hikes. I mean, we're seeing if you like, a cost of living crisis, it's being dubbed in some media. So how do we protect consumers from the costs, particularly those who are in the lowest social income? And while at the same time incentivize this change, because you mentioned you're a taxi driver, but the upfront costs can be prohibitive.
They can. I guess if we look at fossil fuels versus renewable energy, we've seen extraordinary volatility over the last 10 years with fossil fuels, of very high oil prices, very low, high again. Similar with gas, slightly different, but the volatility is the key. Whereas with renewable energy, the graph has tended downwards. The price of photovoltaics has come down rapidly over the last decade. The price of wind energy has come down as well. So it seems to me that the future, if we want to protect the consumer, is to increase the amount of renewables. Yes, we have to be prepared for those days when the wind doesn't blow and the sun don't shine. But I think long distance electricity interconnectors will help. I think there are types of energy storage for green hydrogen and other technologies that will help us there. We do need to have peak shifting. So it's not just one magic bullet that will solve everything. There are a number of different ways of doing this, but the standout technology is renewable energy. And it's a win for climate, it's a win for the consumer, it's a win for prices.
Well, a lot of what Ciarán is saying takes a very positive view, a very optimistic view. Energy market reform isn't easy, Philippe. What are the challenges and what are the potentials to solutions?
I wish I knew, or I wish we could really find what's blocking. There is clearly a tension of price flexibility and protecting, let's say, the most vulnerable. So we have to understand that. I mean, you see here and there, I mean, yellow jackets demonstration where people are saying, give us some checks in front of my gas because I need my gas because I'm addicted to this, and I understand why, because you need that to work and so on. Now, it's true that when you subsidize gas or oil, you're just going backward on what you need to do, which is move to more renewable and so on. So, and then there is probably some resistance from some players, some utilities, of not disrupting the established order. In the end, what I see that those systems are actually working in some of the geographies. They are creating actually wealth. They are reducing frictions between the most needed resources to the most needed customers, let's say. So we have to be surgical. You were saying the scalpel and really understanding where the blocking point. I think what the whole ecosystem has to be very, very focused on is being surgical on indeed finding those blocking points, which are either regulatory or business driven, and remove them, because in the end we have no choice. We have no choice.
Well, I'm going to ask you a very abstract question to wrap up. If I had a magic wand and you could have whatever you wanted for the next 10 years of EU policy in this area, what would be your wish? What would be, if you think would be a magic bullet? I know there's no such thing, but if there was such a thing, what would it be?
Well, I was very enthused when Ursula von der Leyen at the start of this mandate 3 years ago said, the future is the European Green Deal. I think we have to keep that momentum going. I'm grateful that over 3 years, with the crisis of COVID, with the crisis of Ukraine, we have seen the Green Deal remain intact. But I think we know that the challenge of decarbonisation is not a 1 year, a 3 year, or a 5 year journey. It's a lifetime's journey. So my one wish is that we maintain the momentum over the next decade, certainly, and that we ensure that we listen really carefully to the needs of the most vulnerable. You spoke, Philippe, about the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, but the yellow vests are representing a voice that feels left behind. So we have to bring people on this journey with us. That involves listening, it involves consulting, it involves bringing people on this journey with us. And particularly at a time of volatility, we need to make sure that the least well off are protected from the kind of price shocks that we've seen.
And presumably it means not shying away from the difficult questions as well.
I think there are nettles to be grasped, and I think there are populist leaders out there who say, look, things can go on. It can be business as usual forever. But I think we know that the world has changed. The politics of Russian aggression in Ukraine has changed everything, but the politics of climate change have changed everything as well. So it can never be business as usual. We have to adapt or perish.
Philippe, what am I waving my magic wand to deliver for you?
So I would say, speaking in European Commission term, we need the EPBD yesterday. So we need the EPBD, but we need it yesterday. And okay, maybe there are a few things to adjust in the EPBD, but largely speaking, it goes in the right direction of energy efficiency now. Now the point is, it cannot take 3 years. It has to take weeks or months. And my challenge back to the whole European system is, we did it in COVID. How do we do it in the context of an energy war? Because that's what we have in front of us, because we need it sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. That's a fascinating insight, just a snapshot on what we need to deliver the Fit for 55 and the Repower EU packages. So thank you again to Philippe Delorme, the CEO of Europe Operations at Schneider Electric, and from the European Parliament, Ciarán Cuffe MEP, the rapporteur on that EPBD. Thank you very much.